Hello out there, this is Cole Anderson. Welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm coming to you from the road today, and I'm actually in a house right now with some violinists, so if you do hear a little bit of violin playing in the background behind me, that's why. I've been doing some rehearsals here with some of my favorite musicians, and so that's kind of what I've been doing. I'm about to go up to Washington State pretty soon. I'm going to be having a concert on Vashon Island on September 7th at 7:30 p.m. That's Vashon Island, by the way, is kind of near Seattle, so if you are in the Seattle area and you want to come to this concert, it would be great to see you there. I have information about it in the description box as well if you want to get tickets and come out to hear me play. This video was inspired by some work that I'm doing with a student right now. I have a student who's playing the original version of this piece, the Rachmaninoff melody, and we were trying to refine his interpretation a little bit because he's preparing this piece for an exam and he really wanted to get his interpretation just right, according to the score, as close as possible. So we were kind of doing a little bit of listening in his lessons to just discover some kind of interesting recordings and some things that might be useful to refine his own interpretation. And I found two amazing recordings in particular that were just so cool and so wonderful. And this piece in itself is such an interesting piece and so rarely played that I really wanted to share it with you guys because particularly the original version is an excellent piece for the kind of intermediate or intermediate advanced pianist who wants to have some more beautiful repertoire to play. It has all the stuff that's great about Rachmaninoff, all the romantic stuff, but it's not actually quite so imposing technically to learn and master, although there are certainly challenges about it. So the original version of this piece comes from Rachmaninoff's youthful Opus 3. So this set goes all the way back to 1892 when I believe Rachmaninoff was only 19 years old. So some of his earliest piano writing, but actually really quite typical of his style. So one interesting thing about Opus 3 is that it also contains the infamous prelude Opus 3 number 2 in C sharp minor, which became so incredibly popular that Rachmaninoff started to despise it. Supposedly. He was always asked to play it at every concert he ever played practically throughout his entire life, and it was just enormously popular, and Rachmaninoff, of course, could never understand why, since he wrote so many things which he considered to be much better than that later on, but always it was the C-sharp minor prelude that assured his fame and which his fans always wanted to hear. And even to this day, it's still a very popular piece. A lot of amateurs and professionals as well play it and record it. It's a little bit of a shame though because the other pieces in Opus 3 are actually wonderful and would make great pieces again for an amateur or for young students who want to have some more romantic music to play. Also, just as an aside, Rachmaninoff, he dutifully recorded the C-sharp minor prelude, I believe 3 times, and those 3 recordings are actually really, really beautiful, and I strongly recommend listening to them because, of course, he plays that piece in a very personal way, in a very original way that I've never heard anyone else play it like that, and it can really give you an idea of his imagination and what he actually had in mind in a piece like that. But if you're used to the way other people tend to play that piece, it will be kind of surprising to you. And actually, Rachmaninoff plays it so seriously and so beautifully that it kind of makes you realize that he probably didn't really hate the piece as much as he said he did. He was probably a little bit joking. Probably he did resent having to play it constantly, but actually he probably liked it well enough. He seems to have lavished a lot of care on it in his recordings. Now, having said that, though, he also seems to have had a sentimental affection for these other pieces from Opus 3 as well. He actually recorded them all, although the elegy he only did as a piano roll, but all the other ones he recorded at least once, and some of them he recorded more than once, like the Serenade, which I believe is Opus 3 number 5. Don't quote me on that, I'm just saying that off the top of my head, but I believe he recorded that one actually twice. And he also made these revisions of the melody and also of that same Serenade. The Serenade, the differences between the two versions are not quite so extreme, although they are telling and quite fun. The differences between the two versions of the melody, however, are enormous and very fascinating. So it's quite interesting to get to compare the two versions and the two different recordings. The two different recordings I found are also enormously different and also very interesting to contrast them. So I'll get to that in just a second. But first, the compositional qualities of the original. As I said, this is a wonderful example, absolutely just quintessential example of the young Rachmaninoff. There's a very pure, kind of straightforward romanticism. I think the influences are pretty clear. The major influence is no doubt from Tchaikovsky. In fact, this piece wouldn't be out of place, if you played Tchaikovsky's Seasons, for example, and then you played this piece. I doubt anyone would really notice that you had switched composers. Now, actually, if you look a little closer, there are very particular qualities of Rachmaninoff's style. If you know his style, you'll recognize it right away in this piece. But if you were just listening to some Russian romantic music like Tchaikovsky, this piece would also be able to fit in very nicely, kind of camouflage in that style. You can also hear the influence of Grieg as well, I think, Grieg's various character pieces. For example, one very obvious thing is the last cadential gesture. So as you see, Rachmaninoff writes this very, very slow arpeggio in whole notes, but small whole notes. So the idea is that you're kind of improvising this arpeggio, but you're doing it kind of slowly and with this kind of consciousness of every single note. And Grieg actually does very similar things at the end of several of his pieces, perhaps most famously the ending of the slow movement of the piano concerto. He has this very slow arpeggio in small quarter notes, written as kind of a cadenza in one measure. So also, that's the same kind of idea for how that's supposed to be played. At this point, Rachmaninoff had not developed his mature piano compositional style yet. So the writing is much simpler than later Rachmaninoff. It's much more chordal. That's a very clear part of the style. And that aspect of his style is probably partly owing to his interest in Anton Rubinstein. Anton Rubinstein as a pianist was one of his great inspirations, but also as a composer, I think he was a little bit in that style as well when he started out writing. So there's less rhythmical complexity as well, less counterpoint. He hasn't really reached this point of just absolutely overflowing with complex counterpoint and inner lines and so forth. It's much more pure, and the simplicity of the piece is actually very disarming and very charming in a way. So we do get this very consistent texture with the chords and the accompaniment throughout the piece. And the chords are sometimes in the right hand, sometimes in the left hand. The melody kind of weaves around them. So it is still a very well-written piece. It's just not quite as crazily complicated as his later music would become. So the recording that I found, there's actually quite a few very good recordings of this piece. Rachmaninoff himself did not record the original version of this melody, as far as I know. However, there is an absolutely amazing live recording by none other than Sviatoslav Richter. Quite late in his career, this is from 1982, and I believe, if I'm right about this, that this is from a concert that he did featuring works by Rachmaninoff and I think also Tchaikovsky. And an interesting thing about Richter, of course, is that he really, really hated playing hackneyed pieces. So he certainly did not play the prelude, the C-sharp minor prelude, which of course is so famous, and instead found many of these unusual pieces that aren't played very often, like this melody. As usual, Richter plays in a very direct, very clear way. However, it's very interesting what you'll hear. He plays with this overall tempo flexibility that's very striking. So he starts quite slow, very, very slow, in fact, strikingly slow. I've never heard anyone else actually play the piece quite that slowly. It is marked adagio, of course, depending on how slow you think adagio what that really means. And you would think that this tempo is actually slower than what should really work. But what it allows for is that it creates this feeling of wonderful repose at the beginning, and then he begins to warm up and have this slight accelerando that basically continues throughout the middle part of the piece. It reminds me very much actually of another artist that I talked about recently on the channel, Wilhelm Furtwängler, the great German conductor, who Richter, by the way, revered. It reminds me very much of his style as well. Furtwängler would also sometimes start under tempo in kind of a surprising way and warm up to the actual tempo of the full movement. And you hear that in many places in his recordings. So Richter is doing something kind of like that here. There's not so much rubato in more of a local sense. So this is very different actually from Rachmaninoff's playing style, who Rachmaninoff himself actually used a lot of rubato in kind of a localized sense within a phrase. Richter is a little different. It's more of just this overall kind of structured approach where the the tempo gradually accelerates for the middle part of the piece, and then we go back to being quite slow at the end. And there certainly is some rubato in the smaller areas as well, but there's not quite as big a deal about that kind of thing. So I'm going to play you this recording complete from beginning to end. I think it's a magnificent recording, a magical recording, so just sit back and enjoy this performance of the original version of Rachmaninoff's melody. absolutely wonderful. Wasn't that absolutely wonderful? It leaves you with this kind of feeling of just being, I don't know, just kind of walking on air, this sort of feeling of lightness and magic. It's a really, really marvelous performance. Again, a very unusual one. This performance actually encouraged my student to take a little bit of a slower tempo. He had been playing in a little bit more of a flowing way, a little bit more like an andante, that had actually worked for him quite well. But after hearing this recording, it kind of encouraged him to stop and smell the roses a little bit more and to, just kind of slow down and take his time. Although he didn't end up playing this slowly, it still, I think, had a positive effect on the way that he was appreciating every single note. Okay, so now for the revision and the next recording. So the interesting thing here is that the form is actually identical, pretty much identical. Just some of the transitions have been a little bit switched around slightly, but in general, all the same melodic material is there. Basically what you're hearing, it's almost like Rachmaninoff transcribing his own piece or arranging his own piece. If the original is a little bit more in the style of a song with accompaniment, much more straightforward and kind of pure, this is a little bit like his own improvisation on that original song. So it reminds me very much, for example, of Liszt's transcriptions of Schubert songs. Same kind of idea, where things just kind of seem to grow organically out from this very simple origin. So yeah, all the counterpoint, the harmonic subtlety, everything like that has been upgraded to level 11 in this piece. And it's really wonderful, So you could argue that perhaps Rachmaninoff loses something of that purity and that kind of wonderful directness of the original. But on the other hand, there's this wonderful brightness, effulgency about this version, where it just seems to be overflowing with expression and with all these imaginative shapes and rhythms. So it does give you this kind of feeling of kind of natural foliage or trees or whatever you want to imagine like that. But there is this kind of wonderful overflowing natural feeling to it. And there's a very strong improvisational element to this as well. Even the way that Rachmaninoff plays it in this recording, because I am playing you the composer's own recording of this revision, he oftentimes is not exactly following his own notation. So you can tell that he kind of arrived at this version, this revision, through improvisation. And it didn't even really stop after he had it published. I think he was still kind of improvising and slightly changing things here and there as he went along. Now, he has a certain respect for the original, though, in this revision, because sometimes you still hear the original figuration. In fact, often enough, you actually get the original figuration, especially in the middle part of the piece where the chords are repeating. But other times he loosens the figuration up and has arpeggios, various arpeggiated figures, and different types of ways for a melody to interact with that figuration. So more complicated rhythmic structures going on. Also, it's quite interesting to notice that Rachmaninoff changed the tempo indication. So you remember in the original, he marked it adagio. In this one, it's andante. Andante con moto to be exact. So andante with motion. So a little bit more of that older feeling for an andante from the classical period. You might remember from some of my Mozart videos, I talked about how andante for someone like Mozart was much more of a flowing, going tempo, in keeping with the original Italian meaning of andare, to go. And so that's kind of how Rachmaninoff is handling this tempo as well. I feel like you can hear in his playing that there's always kind of a forward momentum and a forward propulsion. Even when he takes some really remarkable liberties and slows down in certain little areas, there's always this underlying kind of flow, almost like a river flowing towards the sea. So maybe Rachmaninoff's original conception was actually of a slightly faster adagio. It's quite possible that that's the case. Richter, of course, just followed his own lights and his own instincts and did something really amazing. It might not even necessarily be what Rachmaninoff was originally imagining. Rachmaninoff might not even have liked it that much, but it can really make an effect with some people. It certainly made an effect with me, and I think many other people find it very beautiful. So another reason to remember that sometimes even if you do something which is not the conception of the original composer, that can still be very valuable. And I'm reminded of the story when Brahms heard Arthur Nikisch, the great Arthur Nikisch, conducting his, I believe it was his second symphony, and he was just amazed and said, "Did I write that? I don't, I never would have even thought of it that way, but yes, that's the way you should do it." Things like that. that really can be the case. A composition really, a composer does everything that they can to make the composition exactly the way they want it, but then it leaves them. It goes into the world and it has its own journey as other musicians come into contact with it and have their own interpretations based on it. So a piece really grows over time and changes, and I think that's exactly the way it should be. So this recording is, in fact, Rachmaninoff playing. It's one of his last recordings, actually. I believe it's from 1940 when he made the revision of the melody. So he didn't make that many recordings after this. So by that time, Rachmaninoff was in his late 60s, but you would never know it from his playing, which was still just as fresh and as powerful as it had been 20 years earlier. And I'm always amazed at the freedom of Rachmaninoff's playing that is encompassed in this kind of logical framework. So it always feels inevitable and like it couldn't be any other way. But the enormous liberty that he takes with timing is quite shocking, I think. I think for many students who are used to kind of beating out time and trying to do rhythm very much correctly, the kind of rhetorical freedom that he takes, it is really kind of shocking. Take this little snippet, for example. Just listen to how much time he takes right in the middle of this phrase. It's almost bizarre when you think about it. Right? That's really striking, but it actually really works. There's this kind of free spoken quality to what he's doing, and because his underlying sense of tempo is so strong and the gradations of rubato that he uses are so smoothly applied, so when he slows down, it's set up just right, and it very smoothly returns the tempo when he's done taking time. So it really feels totally natural and like it couldn't be any other way. And we're just pulled along on the rhythmic structure. Also, it's wonderful, all these subtle kind of unwritten arpeggios and the way that his hands don't always line up. It's always done in this very subtle way, like it's just happening by accident. But you know that he's actually, honed this skill, this way of playing over many, many years to be able to make it sound so natural. This kind of thing could easily sound chaotic and like it really doesn't fit there, but the way Rachmaninoff does it, he only does this sort of thing right in the places where the most expressive moments are. And other times he plays with the hands exactly together. So it really works as an expressive device because he doesn't overuse it. He uses it just when it needs to be there. So I'm sure you're going to love this recording as well. At least I hope you do. I love it also. It's totally different from the Richter recording of the original version, but it has its own marvelous kind of beauty to it. So I think that's it for my talking in this video. I'm just going to send you out with Rachmaninoff's recording of the revision of this melody. Please do check out my new album. I have it up for download on patreon.com. The link is in the description box, but you can also just go to patreon.com/independent pianist, and you can click on my shop to find my new album. You can also sign up to make monthly donations there, a pledge for monthly donations on there, and become one of my dedicated patrons, and that's wonderful if you can. I really, really appreciate that. Every little bit helps me to keep bringing you this content. But if not, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned next week. I'll be back with some more music, some more conversation. So here comes the performance of Rachmaninoff's melody in E by the composer himself.